Monday morning in March of 2005, a 67-year-old retired teacher named Jane Miller woke up at her home in Ohio. She yawned and stretched, feeling well rested after a relaxing weekend the previous day. She'd gone to church with her family, then out to breakfast at their favorite diner, and she'd spent the rest of the day picking up around her house at a very leisurely pace. But after Jane sat up in her bed, rubbed her eyes, and then opened them again, she yelped in shock. There, floating directly over her, was a disembodied head. Jane frantically reached over to her nightstand and grabbed her glasses. She slid them up her nose and looked again, hoping to see something different, i.e., but no, it was definitely a floating face hovering right near the ceiling. And this face, in addition to being very odd because it's floating around in a room, also just looked totally bizarre. The head was shaped almost like a football, and it had piercing eyes and these yellowed bug teeth, and the face stared down at Jane with a hint of malice in its expression. Jane was obviously terrified. She leaped out of bed and raced downstairs to get away from this ghost. In her room, adrenaline was coursing through Jane's body as she fought to catch her breath. And when she reached the kitchen, she whipped around, and luckily, the ghost's face was now gone. It had not followed her. With shaking hands, she grabbed the phone and called her older sister, Melissa. She knew that if anybody would believe this story, it would be her big sister. 10 minutes later, Melissa flew down the street towards her sister's house, risking a speeding ticket in this residential neighborhood to get to Jane's house faster. She pulled into Jane's driveway and threw the car into park, and then ran up the walkway to Jane's house. The moment Melissa stepped inside of Jane's house, immediately something felt off. She couldn't explain it. There was just a coldness in the air. She called out for Jane and found her sister in the kitchen, still in her PJs, sitting in front of an uneaten bowl of cereal. It had been sitting there so long that the Cheerios were bloated and soggy. Jane looked up at Melissa, but her eyes were distant, and her face was pale and scared as she whispered that the faces were now above her and beside her, and everywhere else she looked. Melissa glanced around, but all she saw was the empty kitchen and her. And so Melissa just asked Jane, like, "Hey, are you feeling okay?" And Jane nodded and said, "I'm not crazy. I'm telling the truth." And suddenly, Melissa just felt so bad for Jane, and she assured her that, "You know what? Everything's going to be fine." She told Jane, "I don't think you're crazy," but inside Melissa thought, "Oh my goodness, something mentally could be wrong with her." And that's when a realization dawned on Melissa, as she felt a chill run up her spine. Melissa had read about this kind of thing on Facebook, and she knew exactly who she needed to call. The next day, Melissa was back at Jan's house, anxiously anticipating the arrival of her guest. Just then, she heard a knock at the door, and Melissa raced over to greet Father Ramon Smith. He'd been the pastor at Melissa's church for almost 15 years, and Melissa hoped he'd be able to help Jane. Melissa thanked Father Smith for coming over on such short notice, and she explained how worried she was for Jane and invited him to follow her upstairs to Jane's bedroom. Father Smith smiled and told Melissa that whatever was going on with her sister, they would get to the bottom of it. Melissa crept up the stairs to Jane's bedroom with the sound of Father Smith's footsteps right behind her. And right as Melissa reached the top of the stairs and turned the corner into Jane's bedroom, a wave of icy cold seemed to hit her. To Melissa, it immediately seemed it's like malicious presences were hovering all around her sister, and they didn't like it when Melissa was in the room. Jane was lying in her bed, the covers pulled up to her face. Melissa knew her sister had her eyes closed under there. This pitch darkness made it harder to see all the menacing faces all around her. Melissa quietly told Jane that help had finally arrived, and Jane, when she heard this, threw back the covers to see who was there. She blinked and said hello to Father Smith. Though she was clearly surprised to see him there, Melissa smiled to herself, because this had been her intention, to make sure the creatures that were menacing Jane had no idea who was coming over here. Melissa turned to Father Smith and invited him to begin. Then Melissa stood to the side while Father Smith shook Jane's hand and asked her to explain to him what had been going on over the past couple of days. Jane was a little embarrassed as she began to describe what she was seeing and what she was feeling, but Father Smith didn't actually seem to be listening. Instead, he was studying Jane's hands very carefully, and he was watching her expression and awe of her bodily movements. And Melissa even wondered, what was he doing finally after Jane stopped explaining what was going on with her father. Smith told Jane why he was there. He said her sister Melissa had called him yesterday, worried that Jane was suffering from demonic possession. Melissa nodded in the corner from the moment Jane had described the hallucinations to her. Melissa suspected that a dark entity was possessing her sister, and so she'd called Father Smith in the hopes that he could identify the demons and maybe perform an exorcism to get rid of them. Father Smith was the most devout priest Melissa had ever met. If he couldn't banish the demons back to Kel, it was doubtful anybody else could, except when Father Smith spoke again. He looked at Melissa and told her that he actually wasn't sure there were any demons to banish here. He explained that as Jane was speaking, he'd been trying to see if she had full control of her body, and from what he could tell, Jane was fully in charge of her movements. He hadn't seen any of the involuntary twitches or tics that typically accompany demonic possession. Then the father looked back at Jane and asked her to follow the movement of his finger. As he whirled it all around in front of her father, Smith just shook his head as he watched Jane follow his finger flawlessly. And then Father Smith said that, in his opinion, Jane needed to see a doctor, not an exorcist. Melissa was sort of the dead giveaway to him. These was that Jane knew her hallucinations were not real, but Father Smith promised that if doctors could not figure out what was wrong with Jane, well, the church would call a certified exorcist who was properly trained within the Catholic Church, and that exorcist could examine Jane's psychological state and determine whether she was genuinely possessed or not. Melissa decided this was a good compromise and agreed to take Jane to a hospital right away. Father Smith thanked her and then offered to pray over Jane before he left. Melissa said that would be nice and prayed silently as Father Smith recited a blessing with his hands outstretched. 3 days later, Dr. Randall Crane stood in the hospital room with Jane, watching her sketch a little doodle on his notepad. Dr. Crane was an internal medicine resident at the hospital, and Jane was the most fascinating patient he'd had in a long time. She'd been suffering from these crazy hallucinations for the past few days and was scared that she was losing her mind. Now, Crane didn't know if that was actually true that she was losing her mind, but he could not explain why she was hallucinating faces all the time, and so he couldn't rule out some form of dementia. And so Dr. Crane, kind of on a whim, had asked Jane to go ahead and sketch on his notepad what she was actually seemed like, draw the face. And so Jane finished sketching and handed the notebook back to Dr. Crane, and she warned him that she was no artist, but this is really what she was seeing floating over her head right now and all the time. Dr. Crane looked down at the doodle that Jane had drawn. The Sakan demon face had an oblong, football-shaped head with big buck teeth and round, bulging eyes. It looked more like a Muppet than a monster, in all honesty. It actually reminded him of the main character in an old children's cartoon called Hey Arnold that the doctor had watched all the time when he was a kid. But even if the sketch was sort of funny, he took Jane's condition very seriously. He clearly understood why she'd be terrified to see something like this following her around all the time. And so, Dr. Crane asked Jane a few questions, like whether these hallucinations had spoken to her, or if she was experiencing headaches, fever, or seizures around the time these hallucinations appeared. And she said no to all of them, and so Dr. Crane told Jane not to worry. He was going to order some routine blood work to see if maybe she had an infection, and also ordered a toxicology screening just to rule out any bad drug. Interactions. An hour later, Jane sat on the examination table, feeling very anxious. Dr. Crane told her that all her tests had come back normal, which actually initially made Jane more nervous. She wondered if now she and Alyssa would have to call that certified exorcist after all. But Dr. Crane did not seem like he was totally confused. He actually said, "Jane, I want to look at your eyes more closely." And so Jane leaned forward and then followed Dr. Crane's instructions as he first tested her peripheral vision and then also her forward eyesight. And then afterwards, Dr. Crane informed Jane that she had a couple of small blind spots in her vision that he had just discovered that made him want to examine her retinas a bit more closely. Dr. Crane took a little vial of liquid out of his white coat pocket and then told Jane to look, straight up. He was going to dilate her retinas, the light-sensitive tissue at the back of the eye that transmits. What? See, to the brain, the doctor would first pour a little of that liquid into her eyes, and then he would use a device called an ophthalmoscope to shine some light on her retinas and get a better look at what was going on. And so, as the liquid made her eyes become more sensitive, the light from the ophthalmoscope stung a bit. But Jane did her best to stay still as Dr. Crane looked at her retinas, and then finally, Dr. Crane switched off the ophthalmoscope. And he smiled. He would order a CT scan to confirm his theory, but he was pretty sure he knew exactly what was going on. And 2 hours later, the CT scan confirmed Dr. Crane's suspicion. He told Jane that he'd seen some tiny yellow tissue deposits behind her retinas. These are a sign that her retinas are deteriorating, a condition called macular degeneration. It happens to lots of people as they age. Their eyesight gets worse, and because of that, the brain gets less visual information from their eyes. Now, most people with macular degeneration end up with nothing more serious than slightly blurrier eyesight, but in about 10% of cases, the brain tries to compensate for the lack of information by making up new visuals for reasons that are still not clear. Many of these people who are in this 10% see floating faces. It's very rare, but the symptoms are so consistent amongst patients who suffer from it that Dr. Crane immediately understood what Jane's problem was. The moment he saw her, she teamed that football-shaped head doodled 3 months after her diagnosis. Jane was, fortunately, still having hallucinations, but they were growing more infrequent. Dr. Crane told Jane that while there was no treatment, the hallucinations can stop over time as the brain becomes more accustomed to vision loss, and at the very least, Jane could rest assured, knowing that she was not possessed by a demonic entity, and she wasn't losing her mind either. She just had a very creative brain. Our second story, called The Perfect Condition, on May 19th, 2010, 75-year-old Ron Speeden was at home in Brewster, Massachusetts, relaxing in his favorite armchair and flipping through TV channels in search of something good to watch. He finally settled on a game show when his wife Nancy called him for dinner. He sighed and turned off the TV, muttering about how he'd just gotten comfortable. He hobbled out of his chair and adjusted the plastic tube that he wore under his nose to help him breathe. The year before, Ron had been diagnosed with empyema, a lung disease that causes shortness of breath. Empyema is common in smokers, and Ron had been a smoker his whole life now. As a result, he needed an oxygen tank just to breathe properly. Ron sat down at the dining room table just as Nancy set a plate of scallops in front of him. Ron caught a whiff of melted butter, but his stomach didn't rumble with hunger the way it usually did when he smelled Nancy's amazing cooking. In fact, he didn't have an appetite at all, which was a shame because NY scallops were his favorite meal. But Ron didn't want to be rude, so he thanked Nancy for dinner and tried to eat as best as he could. But he really just couldn't, and just kind of pushed the food around his plate And then, when Nancy was done eating, Ron quickly got up and helped her clear the table and clean up before Ron settled back down to watch more TV. 2 weeks later, in early June, Ron was back in his favorite armchair in the living room, working on the daily crossword puzzle. He wasn't feeling his best because he really had not eaten much since that scallop dinner a couple weeks ago now. Ron didn't think too much of it. He was getting older, and so he thought maybe he just didn't need as much food. Ron reread a clue on his crossroad puzzle that had been stumping him all morning. He started to call out for Nancy, hoping she could help him, when a small tickle rose in his chest. He cleared his throat, and then, all of a sudden, he began coughing and hacking, and he couldn't stop. His chest felt stiff, like there was a wall of mucus. The chest was not breaking up as he leaned back in his armchair, coughing so hard it was getting hard to even breathe. He heard his footsteps behind him, and a minute later, Nancy was by his side with a glass of water. Ron tried to sip some down, but another cough hit him, and he spit the water everywhere. By the time this coughing fit passed Ron's throat was so sore, he'd never experienced a cough like that, and it really scared him. He worried his empyema was getting worse later. That night, Ron was in his bedroom, putting on pajamas, when his back suddenly went stiff, almost like a spasm. He hacked and coughed until he was shaking, and then Nancy came into the bedroom and rubbed his back until finally Ron began to recover. Once he had Nancy asked him if he wanted to call the doctor, but he told her no. Clearly, his empyema was just getting worse, and he would just have to deal with it after decades and decades of smoking cigarettes. He knew his lungs just were not what they used to be. A few days later, Nancy was moving all through the house, vacuuming and cleaning up, trying to prep the house for Ron's sister and brother-in-law, who were coming over to visit. The couple had just gotten back from Scotland on a vacation, and they were coming over to talk about the trip and catch up. Secretly, Nancy hoped they brought home some Scottish shortbread to share. Just before 5 p.m., the doorbell rang, and so Nancy called out to Ron, who was asleep in his armchair when she last saw him. Then Nancy threw open the front door and embraced her in-laws. She was always happy to see them, but especially right as she wanted to be around family. Over the past few days, Ron's coughing fits had become so severe and so frequent. I mean, it was kind of scary. It was common for Ron to be doubled over and hacking up a lung 15 or 16 times a day, and so Nancy was genuinely worried about Ron's health, and so just liked the idea of having some family around. Maybe take her mind off of that for a second. Nancy's brother-in-law handed her a brown bag that smelled like butter and seafood. Nancy opened it as she led the way inside, and the bag was full of her favorite lobster rolls, not from Scotland, but just from down the street. However, still, it was a welcome treat. Nancy led everyone into the living room, where Ron was still fast asleep. Nancy shook his leg and told, but she could see Ron's chest was rising and falling, so he seemed okay. And so she told her in-laws it might be best not to wake him. His coughing fits had been really bad lately, and clearly had been tiring him out. Nancy moved into the kitchen to grab plates for the lobster rolls. She could hear her in-laws taking seats in the dining room, and just then, Nancy heard a familiar, horrible cough erupt in the living room. Nancy felt terrible for Ron as she listened to him hacking. She knew it was also very painful for him. His throat had been raspy and awry for the last 2 weeks because of these coughing fits. Then Ron started gasping between his horrible coughs, like he couldn't even breathe. And then Nancy heard him groaning a little, as though he was calling out for help, and so Nancy rushed into the living room. Ron was rocking in his chair, fighting for air between these violent coughs. His entire body was shaking, and Nancy thought he might be having a seizure. Panicked, she dialed 911 for the next few minutes. Nancy and her in-laws tried to soothe Ron until the EMTs finally arrived. By the time they had Ron on a stretcher and were rolling him into the ambulance, one of the EMTs told Nancy that she'd been right to call Ron's blood pressure and oxygen saturation levels dangerously low. If she hadn't called Ron, would likely be facing organ failure. And so, as the EMT helped Nancy up into the ambulance, she felt terrified. Music Hospital. The next morning, the pulmonary and critical care specialist at Cape Cod Hospital, Dr. Scott Slater, made his way to Ron's hospital room. When Ron was brought to the emergency room the previous night, he had been quickly diagnosed with pneumonia, a lung infection that creates buildup of fluid in the air sacs. For someone of Ron's age, pneumonia can be a very dangerous and even deadly condition. Now, the ER doctor had immediately given Ron antibiotics to help him fight off the infection. But so far, Ron was not getting better. So just an hour ago, Dr. Slater had ordered a chest x-ray. And now, because of that x-ray, he had a better idea of what was going on inside of Ron's lungs. Dr. Slater knocked on the doorway and walked into Ron's room. Ron was lying in bed, hooked up to an IV and an oxygen tank. Ron looked pale and tired, and his breathing was labored. Nancy was sitting in a chair beside him, and she looked up from the newspaper she'd been reading and gave Dr. Slater a weak smile. Dr. Slater gave her a sad look, and then delivered the bad news. Ron's X-ray had revealed that he had a collapsed lung, which was likely causing his pneumonia. Dr. Slater guessed that the lung had collapsed because something was walking. It's an airway. He needed to get a closer look by performing a bronchoscopy, which meant sliding a little camera down Ron's throat and into his lungs after giving Ron an injection of local anesthesia, which would mean Ron was awake. But, unable to feel pain, Dr. Slater slid the camera down Ron's esophagus, and immediately the problem became clear. There was an abnormal-looking mass at the top of Ron's left bronchial tube. Dr. Slater couldn't tell what this mass was, so he took a little tissue sample of this mass to send to the labs for analysis. After he pulled the camera out of Ron's throat, Dr. Slater explained to Ron and to Nancy that he had found this mass inside of Ron's lungs. Now, it would be a few days before they'd know for sure what it was, but the doctor felt they should know right now that that mass could be cancer. As Dr. Slater left the hospital room, Ron felt terrified, but Nancy, she shook her head and told Ron there was no point panicking until they knew the biopsy results. And then she kissed Ron on the forehead and told him she was going to step into the hallway and call their kids and his sister and let them know what was going on. Ron watched his wife leave, feeling his chest tight, but not because another coughing fit was coming on. He was thinking about how much time he'd have left if the biopsy came back positive for lung cancer. It could be a matter of months, or maybe even less. The thought of leaving his family now brought on this horrible wave of fear. He could feel tears swelling up in his eyes as he looked out into the hallway and watched Nancy pace as she called their loved ones to break the terrible news. 4 days later, Ron was still in the hospital, sitting up in bed, tray of hospital food in front of him. He still wasn't hungry, so he just drank the juice out of the little plastic fruit cup they had given him. Meanwhile, Nancy, who had rarely left his bedside, was doing her best to try to coax her husband into taking a few bites. But just then, Ron heard a knock. But then a smile crept across Dr. Slater's face. He told Ron and Nancy that there were absolutely signs of infection in the tissue, but no cancer cells. Ron was so relieved, he almost started crying. He rubbed his eyes and felt Nancy's hand squeezing his shoulder. Ron breathed in as deeply as he could, trying to steady himself. He didn't have cancer, but there was still a mass in his lung, and Ron thought that couldn't be normal. And so he asked Dr. Slater, since this mass was not a cancerous tumor, well, what? Said Dr. Slater, admitted to Ron that he didn't know, but he hoped that a second biopsy would help him find out. 10 days later, Dr. Slater sat in the office of a colleague, Dr. Jeff Spain. Dr. Spain was a thoracic surgeon who specialized in the organs and tissue inside the chest. Dr. Slater had always considered him a good friend, and now Dr. Slater hoped that Dr. Spain could be a good consultant too. Dr. Slater was feeling frustrated with Ron's case and really needed a second opinion. Dr. Slater explained to Dr. Spain that Ron's pneumonia had persisted and his cough had gotten worse over the past week and a half. It was almost like Ron's body was trying to cough up the mass on its own. But after 2 biopsies, Dr. Slater still didn't have any idea what this mass was. It looked like a tumor, but it was not cancerous, so it wasn't clear why it was making Ron so sick. Dr. Slater bounced his knees impatiently as Dr. Spain read through Ron's file. Finally, Dr. Spain, but this time they would put Ron under general anesthesia. If Ron was totally unconscious, they could do a more in-depth examination of Ron's chest. Dr. Slater was skeptical, but at this point, he was willing to try anything, so he agreed to let Dr. Spain perform this procedure around 2 p.m. that afternoon. Dr. Slater was sitting in his office when he got a call from his friend, Dr. Spain. He just finished Ron's bronchoscopy, and now he said he had only one question for Dr. Slater. Did he have any music? Stirred for a moment, Dr. Slater was sure he'd misheard Dr. Spain until Dr. Spain repeated himself and said that Dr. Slater was going to need some dirt for the thing he just found inside of Ron's lung. A sprouting pea plant, as in a living vegetable. Dr. Slater couldn't believe it. Ron must have eaten a raw pea that quite literally went down the wrong tube. Instead of landing in his stomach, it got into his lung, and there the moist and warm conditions inside the lung were just right for the little pea to sprout. According to Dr. Spain, the pea sprout was about half an inch long. It had clearly been in Ron's lung for a while because it was so coated in mucus that it looked like a little tumor. Dr. Spain had easily removed the pea and surrounded mass, and Ron immediately began feeling better. Within a few days, he was coughing far less frequently, and his pneumonia disappeared. Ron still had emphysema, but it was far more manageable without the hacking cough. His appetite. On May 20th, 1967, a 50-year-old man named Stefan Mullock staggered into the Misericordia Hospital in Winnipeg, Canada. Stefan was so physically weak that his oldest son Mark was there with him, physically holding him into the hospital. When the nurses at the front desk saw the pair walk in, they immediately got up and walked around their desk over to these 2 guys and said, "Hey, what's going on? What's wrong with him?" And so Stefan at this point is so uncomfortable, he can barely talk. And then he tells the nurses that earlier that day, he had been burned on his chest and stomach, and now he had this blinding headache, and he was so nauseous, and he could barely walk. The nurses knew clearly this is an emergency, and so they quickly ushered the pair down the hall to an exam room, and then a couple of minutes later, doctors came into the room and they asked Stefan to show them his burns. Stefan, who was already lying on his back, on the exam table, slowly reaches down and grabs the bottom of his shirt, and he lifts it up, and the doctors, stunned at what they see on his stomach. There was a very strange burn pattern that none of them had seen before, and so the doctors, they move in to get a better look at his injury, and as they're staring at it, they ask Stefan to explain how he got this burn. Now, what the doctors didn't realize is that Stefan was very conflicted. He knew if he told the truth about how he got this burn, then he would open himself and his family up to ridicule and skepticism. But as he's laying there and the doctors are waiting for his answer, he finally decides that the right thing to do here is just tell the truth. And so he takes a deep breath and then tells the doctors what happened to him, and by the time he was finished telling this story of what happened to his stomach, the doctors had stopped looking at his injury and instead were just standing in the middle of the room staring at Stefan. with eyes wide and their mouths open. They were all, literally, speechless. Within 24 hours, Steph's story had made news all over the world, and his story had attracted the attention of numerous US and Canadian secretive government agencies who were keen to interview Stephen one-on-one to really find out what he knew. In short, what Stephen claimed happened to him, dubbed the Falcon Lake incident, was a very big deal. However, the farther this story went, and the more people that heard it, the more people started to question the validity of this story. It just seemed too unbelievable that maybe Stephen is just lying, or this is a hoax. And so, before I tell you Stephen's actual account of what happened at Falcon Lake, I'm going to give you a little context about who Stephen was prior to the incident, because ultimately, Stephen's credibility in your eyes will determine if you really believe what happened to Music Camp. Stephen was born in the early 20th century in Poland, and when World War II broke out, he was captured by the Nazis and put into one of their concentration camps. It was called the Gross Rosen Camp, and it was located in Poland. During his time at that camp, Stefan would bear witness to the Nazis perpetrating some of the worst atrocities ever committed against humanity. In total, approximately 125,000 people were held prisoner at the Gross Rosen Camp, including Stefan, and of those 125,000, 40,000 of them would be killed, primarily on site at the camp or on a nail of death. March after the camp was finally liberated in early 1945, Stephen worked as a translator for the U.S. Army, helping them continue to liberate other concentration camps across Europe. But by 1946, Stefan was ready to leave Europe and start a new life somewhere else, and put World War II behind him. And so he and his wife, who also was held in a concentration camp during World War II, fled Poland with their 3 young kids and resettled in Winnipeg, Canada. And for the next 20 years, the Malik lived a very peaceful life. Stefan would find work as a mechanic at a cement factory, and his wife and his kids would make many friends and fall in love with the Winnipeg community. However, the Mike's life would take a sudden turn for the worst on May 20th, 1967. That was the day, the Falcon Lake incident. Stephen was a very passionate, amateur prospector. A prospector is someone who searches the earth for mineral deposits, usually gold or silver, forest and up over the mountains, stopping to hack into the earth with his pickaxe in hope of discovering treasures underneath the surface. Now Stephen almost never found any treasures on any of his prospecting journeys, but he wasn't really in prospecting for the riches. Stephen just loved being outdoors and being in nature. It was very calming and peaceful for him, and considering how traumatic his earlier life had been, being in the concentration camp during World War II, finding moments of peace in his life was very important to him. And so, in May of 1967, Stephen decided to go out on another one of his prospecting trips, this time to an area called Falcon Lake. Falcon Lake is a fairly large lake, located about 100 miles to the east of Winnipeg, and surrounding this lake was a big forest that Stephen had heard contained silver deposits tucked away in the hillsides. And so, on Friday, May 19th, Stephen was ready to go on this trip, and so he packed up all of his prospecting equipment. He said goodbye to his wife and his kids, and then he left the house and made his way to the bus stop, where he hopped on a Greyhound, a bus. 2 hours later, he got off the bus at the stop closest to Falcon Lake, and from there he made his way to this cheap motel that was right on the side of the highway. He got a room, he got a quick to eat in their cafe, and then returned to his room and went to bed the next morning, May 20th, 1967. So, the day of the Falcon Lake incident, Stephen woke up early, right around 5 a.m., and by 5:30 a.m., he had all of his equipment either in his backpack or on his belt, and he was making his way out of the motels. front doors right outside of this motel was the highway that ran left to right, and on the other side of that highway was this huge forest that Falcon Lake was deep inside of. And so, after Stefan left the motel, he crossed over that highway and began walking into the woods, and for the next several hours, Stefan just kind of meandered his way through the woods. He wasn't on a trail. He was just using his compass to make sure he was generally walking around Jill. Hey. So he's been hiking now for several hours. He looked up ahead and he saw there was a clearing on the side of this hill. And so Stefan walked into this clearing, and two things became immediately apparent. One, he was right, near Falcon Lake. From his perspective on this clearing, he could look down just a couple of 100 feet, and there was the lake. And two, the reason this clearing existed and why no trees were growing on he at all is because under his feet was just a huge rock face, like a quartz vein, that was running across this hillside. And so this was like the perfect place for Stefan to begin prospecting. And so he set his things down. He got out his pickaxe, he got his welding gloves on, he put on his welding goggles as well. They protected his eyes from any rocks that were flying as he was hacking into the ground. And then he got to work. For the next couple of hours, Stefan very diligently hacked away at the, but he didn't find any silver or anything else of note. And so around 11 a.m., Stefan was hungry and tired, okay? And so he put his pickaxe down, he took his goggles off, he took his gloves off, and he sat down on this rock facing the, lake to have some lunch. And as he sat there enjoying his food, all he could hear in the distance were the sound of a few geese down on the lake making some noise. But other than that, it was totally quiet. After he was done eating, he put his gear back on one and got back to work about an hour later. At around 12, Stefan was still hacking away at the rock when, despite all the noise he was making as he smashed the ground with his pickaxe, he could hear a really loud commotion coming from behind him. And it turned out, when he stopped the pickaxe, the commotion sounded like geese honking and going wild. And so he dropped his pickaxe, he took his goggles, put them up on his forehead, and then he stood up and turned around, and he looked down towards the lake where he heard all these geese going crazy. And the first thing he noticed was there were some geese on the lake that appeared to be flying off in different directions, like it had been startled. But what really immediately caught his attention was not the geese, but what had very likely startled the geese, and that was two bright glowing red objects that were flying slowly across the lake towards him, kind of roughly over where the geese were. And now these objects, they were cylindrical. They appeared to be about maybe 30 or 40 feet wide. They didn't have any sort of emission coming off of them. They weren't making any noise. They were just kind of slowly making their way over towards where Stefan was now. As Stefan is watching this happen, he wasn't fearful. He assumed those have to be military aircraft, as it was this part of Canada. Falcon Lake is very remote. There's not many people around, and so logically it made sense that perhaps there's a military that's doing training exercises in this area. And so, feeling much more intrigued than fearful, Stefan just continued to watch as these red aircraft got closer and closer to his side of the lake. And then, when these two craft were about 200 feet away from where Stefan was standing, they came to a stop, and they were just hovering in the air. And then, one of the craft suddenly turned orange and began going up into the clouds, and then, at some point, just vanished. And then, the other aircraft, instead of going up, just continued, descending very slowly now, very clearly, towards this open rock face that Stefan was standing on now. Again, Stefan was totally convinced that these were military aircraft, and so he's not fearful. He is just intrigued by what he's seeing. And in fact, by this point, he had convinced himself that this second aircraft that was now coming down to land on these rocks must have experienced some sort of issue, and they were landing in order to fix it. And Stefan even thought to himself, well, hey, I'm a mechanic. Maybe I can help the pilot or pilots with whatever's going. Okay, on with their craft. Once the craft finally did touch down on the rocks, about 150 feet away from Stefan, it changed colors from red to stainless steel with an orange glow around the outside of the aircraft and inside of this craft. Okay, really bright purple light came on that Stefan was only aware of because there was a couple of small holes on the outside of this craft where this purple light was coming through. But these little rays of purple light coming out of this craft were so bright that it actually was hard for Stefan to look directly at the craft, and so his welding goggles were still on his forehead. So he pulled them down, put them over his eyes, and his welding goggles had a kind of tint to them. So it was like he was looking through sunglasses, and with those on, he was able to continue looking, okay, at the craft. And so, through his goggles, Stefan is still just standing in the same spot where he first saw these craft, okay? And he's watching this craft, and he's, okay, fully expecting any minute for the pilot or pilots to come out of the craft and explain what's going on. But at first, nothing happens, and so Stefan is just standing there, waiting for something to happen when he realizes he has his sketchbook in his pocket. Stefan liked to bring his sketchbook along on his prospecting trips because he liked to sketch things, and so he figured while he waited for the pilot or pilots to emerge, he would sketch the craft. And so for the next couple of minutes, that's what he did. And then after he was done sketching it, he put his sketchbook away. And then really nothing happened for about another 30 minutes. He just stood there and the craft remained motionless. But after about 30 minutes of the craft having landed, it opened. There was like a sliding door on the side of the craft facing Stefan, and it revealed the beautiful bright purple exterior of this craft. But from Stefan's perspective, because of how bright the lights were and how far away he was, he couldn't tell. Well, okay, clearly now the pilot or pilots are coming outside. And so Stefan felt really relieved, and he was just standing there waiting to talk to whoever was inside. But again, nothing happened. And so, now feeling just plain curious, Stefan decided, you know what? I'm going to walk over there, and I'm going to yell into this open door to the pilot or pilots inside and make sure they're okay. And so, he starts slowly making his way across the rock face towards this craft and this open door. And when he gets about 60 feet away from the craft, he suddenly stops, because now he can hear from inside of this craft the sound of two voices talking to each other. He can't really tell what they're saying, but very clearly there is communication. It's happening inside of this craft, and so Stefan assumed that must be the pilots. And so he called out to them in English, and the second Stefan yelled out to this craft, the voices immediately came to a stop, and they did not respond to Stefan. And so Stefan is calling out to them in English, hey, are you okay? What are you doing in there? And when English didn't work, Stefan called out in Russian, called out in German, Italian, French, Ukrainian, and when all of those didn't work, he went back to English and just continued kind of calling out, trying to get them to please come out and talk to him. But he got no response, and no one came out of the craft. And so, at this point, Stefan thought, okay, I'm totally committed, so I need to keep going and make sure the pilot or pilots are okay. And so, he continued walking closer and closer to this open door of the craft, and when he got about 10 feet away, he was suddenly struck by the incredible craftsmanship of this craft. He couldn't see any rivets anywhere on the amazing piece of machinery, meaning this craft appeared like it had somehow been carved out of one enormous piece of steel, which seemed totally impossible. Also, Stefan noticed there were no insignia on the outside of this craft. There was no flag or anything kind of denoting who was flying it. There was really nothing on the outside of the craft. But Stefan just kept on going till he was standing right outside of this open door. He's only a couple feet away from it, and now he's looking directly inside, and he doesn't see the pilot or pilots, and in fact, because of how bright this purple light is coming out. Even with his goggles, it's really hard to see what's inside of this craft, but he can clearly see inside there is some sort of panel in the back of the craft with lots of flashing lights, almost like a computer, and there were other kind of columns of light moving around inside the craft at different angles. But after looking in this craft for only a few seconds, the door suddenly slid shut, and then Stefan, without really thinking about it, reached out and touched the craft. And the second he did that, two things happened. One, the hand that he touched the craft with, he was wearing a big welding glove. And the second he made contact with that craft, the leather glove began to melt, not even catch on fire. It just instantly. And so he began frantically ripping the glove off to get it off of him to avoid injury. And then the second thing that happened is the craft began rotating counterclockwise until this vent that was on the outside of the craft, one of the very few things that was on the outside of the craft that actually Stefan had noted in his sketch. He had drawn this grate that sat on the outside of the craft. This grate rotated around until it was aimed directly at Stefan. Now, to picture this great picture, like a vent you would see inside of a building where air conditioning blows air out of, right? It's kind of like that. Same size, the size of a lead plate on a car, and instead of there being vertical slats along the vent, like you would see with an air conditioning vent cover on this vent on this craft, it was like a checkerboard pattern with little button holes all over this vent. And so Stefan is looking at this vent, and then suddenly something shoots through the vent like an explosion that hits him square in the chest and lights him on fire. His shirt is literally in flames. And so Stefan is frantically trying to rip off his shirt. He throws it on the ground, stomping the flame, and as he's doing that, he looks up and sees this craft has somehow immediately shot into the sky. It is now disappearing into the clouds. Now, Stefan had no idea what just happened. All he knew is his chest and his stomach now, but before he could deal with that, he developed this unbelievable headache. He suddenly felt so nauseous, okay? And he felt delirious, like he was drunk, trying not to panic. Stefan, who now is shirtless and badly burned, he ran over and grabbed some of his things. And then he began heading back into the woods to make his way back towards the motel. It would take him several hours of stumbling through the forest, stopping periodically to vomit. But he would eventually reach the highway. He would cross over and he would make his way into the motel right around 400 p.m. And when he got there, he made his way into the cafe and he asked the staff if they knew where the nearest doctor was. These staff members would later tell investigators that when Stefan came tumbling into the Kia without his shirt on, looking totally horrible, they assumed he was drunk. But after talking to him, he didn't smell at all like alcohol. Instead, let's hear of this horrible sulfur smell. The staff would tell Stefan that the nearest doctor was 45 mile away. And so at this point, Stefan decided his best bet was Chile to just get on the bus and go back to Winnipeg, where his family could take him to the nearest hospital. And so, somehow, Stefan managed to make his way to the bus stop. He hopped on a Greyhound bus, and then his oldest son, Mark, met him at the bus stop and practically carried him into the hospital. The very strange checkerboard burn pattern found on Stefan's abdomen, where he claims this craft turned its vent, then fired on him, were determined not to be thermal burns, meaning he didn't get them from something hot touching his skin, like everyone initially suspected. Instead, they were determined to be chemical burns. But literally, no one, doctors, scientists, government agencies, no one could figure out what chemical actually burned his skin. In fact, no one was ever able to actually identify what was causing all these ailments that Stefan was complaining of, from the headache, to the nausea, to the weakness, to these burns. And he was tested for basically everything, from radiation poisoning to very common ailments and illnesses. And everything came back negative. Experts would go out to Falcon lake to the area that Stefan described. Seeing this craft, and sure enough, they would find an open rock face and right. Around the area that Stefan described was the circular burn pattern, as if something had been perched right there, sought some sort of exhaust into the ground in the area around this landing. Site was determined to be highly radioactive, although it is assumed that the reason that area is radioactive is because there's a vein of radium that runs underneath the rocks near the area. However, what no one could explain away were the 3 identical pieces of what looked like metal, which actually turned out to be a very rare type of silver that were located near this burned circle. Now, even though the Falcon Lake area was known apparently for having silver deposits up in the hillsides, these 3 pieces of silver were not from the hillsides of Falcon Lake. This silver was heavily manufactured. Some machine had manipulated the metal to bend and be cut in a very particular way. And all 3 of these pieces of very rare silver were highly radioactive. They would also find traces of this very rare type of silver that seemed to have seeped into some of the loose rocks that were inside of that burned out circle, almost like the silver had melted into the rock. But despite these pieces of spiness that do seem to suggest that Stefan really did see some craft land on these rocks, and despite the fact that the US government and the Canadian government both thoroughly investigated this case and they were not able to debunk it, they basically said, well, something happened, but we don't know. What? Despite all of that, Stefan and his family's lives were forever upended. After this incident, Stefan was ridiculed and accused of lying and of being crazy, and his kids were unfortunately bullied at school. Shortly before Stefan died in 1999, at the age of 83, he was asked if he regretted coming forward with this story. And he would say, yes, I wish I never told anyone. But he would also say, at the time, really felt like he had a duty to tell the world about what happened. Stefan never changed his story. And I think it was an experimental aircraft. That's it. He also never made a dime on this experience. If anything, he lost money because he paid to write a 40-page pamphlet that explained what happened to him. And then he left all these copies on his porch. So if people showed up, or if nosy neighbors showed up and had questions, he would just point to the stack of the books and say, take one and read.